On January 21, 1824, a British column of approximately 500 men soldiers, colonial militia, and allied African fighters marched confidently through the dense forests of the Gold Coast, pursuing what they believed was a retreating Ashanti army. Sir Charles MacCarthy, the British governor, personally commanded this force, convinced that European discipline and firepower would easily overcome what he considered a rabble of African warriors armed with primitive weapons. By day's end, MacCarthy would be dead, his head severed to become a trophy in the Ashanti capital, and his entire column would be annihilated in one of the most complete military disasters ever suffered by British forces in Africa. Fewer than 20 Europeans survived the battle, fleeing through the jungle while the Ashanti hunted stragglers and celebrated a victory so total that it would halt British expansion in West Africa for decades. The Battle of Nsamankow was not just a military defeat, but a shattering of European assumptions about African military capability, a demonstration that sophisticated tactics, superior numbers, and intimate knowledge of terrain could overcome technological advantages, and a reminder that imperial confidence was no substitute for proper reconnaissance, respect for one's enemy, and sound tactical judgment. This is the story of how an African empire destroyed a British army in the jungle, and how one day's fighting forced the British Empire to recognize that conquest in Africa would require far more than arrogance and muskets. To understand how such a catastrophic defeat occurred, we must first examine the context of British-Ashanti relations in the early 1820s, and the dangerous miscalculations that led MacCarthy into the forests of what is now Ghana. The Ashanti Empire in the early 19th century was one of West Africa's most powerful and sophisticated states, controlling a territory roughly the size of England with a population of several million. The Ashanti had built their power on military prowess, control of gold resources, and a centralized state structure that could mobilize large armies for extended campaigns. Their military system was sophisticated, with organized regiments, clear command structures, and tactics refined through decades of warfare against neighboring states. The British presence on the Gold Coast in 1824 was limited to a series of coastal forts and trading posts, focused primarily on commerce rather than territorial control. But tensions between British interests and Ashanti power had been building for years. The Ashanti sought to extend their influence to the coast, which would give them direct control over trade with Europeans. The British wanted to protect their coastal Alismore estates, who paid tribute to Britain and looked to British power to shield them from Ashanti expansion. These incompatible objectives made conflict increasingly likely. Sir Charles MacCarthy had arrived as governor of the Gold Coast settlements in 1822, bringing with him the confidence and racial assumptions typical of British colonial officials of the era. MacCarthy was a military man, a veteran of campaigns in the West Indies, and utterly convinced of European military superiority over African forces. He had studied accounts of earlier conflicts between Europeans and Africans, most of which emphasized European victories achieved through discipline and firepower. What MacCarthy failed to understand was that the Ashanti were not the disorganized forces that Europeans had faced elsewhere, and that the dense forests of the Gold Coast created tactical conditions very different from those in open terrain where European advantages were more decisive. In 1823 and early 1824, tensions escalated into open warfare. Ashanti armies invaded the coastal regions, and MacCarthy organized a military response designed to drive them back and teach the Ashanti a lesson about challenging British power. His plan was straightforward: advance inland with a mixed force of British soldiers, local militia, and allied African fighters, locate the main Ashanti army, and defeat it in battle through superior discipline and firepower. MacCarthy believed that a single decisive British victory would shatter Ashanti power and establish British dominance over the region. The force MacCarthy assembled reflected both the limited British military presence on the coast and the overconfidence that would prove fatal. The core of his column consisted of fewer than 200 British soldiers and officers, supplemented by several hundred African troops from coastal allies and Cape Coast militia. Total strength was approximately 500 men, adequate in MacCarthy's view because he expected European training and weapons to multiply their effectiveness many times over. The column was equipped with muskets, bayonets, and several small artillery pieces, along with supplies for a brief campaign. What MacCarthy's intelligence failed to grasp was the size and sophistication of the Ashanti force he was advancing toward. The Ashanti army in the field numbered approximately 10,000 warriors, organized into regiments under experienced commanders, equipped with thousands of muskets acquired through trade along with traditional weapons, and operating in terrain they knew intimately. The Ashanti had been tracking MacCarthy's advance since he left the coast, using scouts to monitor his movements and positions while carefully concealing their own strength and locations. The Ashanti military system was far more sophisticated than MacCarthy imagined. Warriors were organized into regimental structures based on their home regions, each with distinctive insignia and fighting traditions. Command was centralized under the Asanahin's generals, who could coordinate movements of multiple units across difficult terrain. Tactical doctrine emphasized encirclement and the use of terrain, with forces moving through the forest to surround enemies and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Ashanti had been refining these tactics through constant warfare, and they understood how to use the dense vegetation to neutralize European advantages in discipline and volley fire. On January 21, 1824, MacCarthy's column was deep in the forest north of the British coastal settlements, following reports that suggested an Ashanti force was nearby and possibly retreating. The column was strung out along a forest trail, its formation dictated by the narrow paths through dense vegetation. Visibility was limited to a few dozen yards in most directions, the thick canopy overhead creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. MacCarthy had almost no intelligence about Ashanti positions or strength, relying instead on assumptions that any African force would avoid confrontation with a European-led column. These assumptions were catastrophically wrong. The Ashanti had no intention of avoiding battle. Instead, they had carefully positioned their forces to envelop MacCarthy's column and destroy it. As the British advance guard moved along the forest trail, they suddenly encountered Ashanti forces directly ahead. MacCarthy, riding near the front of the column, ordered his troops to deploy and prepare for battle, apparently believing this was a chance encounter with a smaller Ashanti force that could be quickly defeated. What happened next demonstrated the sophistication of Ashanti tactics and the completeness of British miscalculation. As MacCarthy's troops deployed to engage the Ashanti force in front of them, thousands of additional Ashanti warriors attacked from both flanks and the rear, emerging from the forest in a coordinated assault that had clearly been planned and positioned in advance. Within minutes, MacCarthy's column was completely surrounded, attacked from all directions by Ashanti forces that vastly outnumbered them and that used the forest cover to devastating effect. The British attempt to form organized defensive positions collapsed almost immediately. In the dense forest, maintaining formation was nearly impossible. Units became separated by thick vegetation, unable to see or support each other. The Ashanti, moving through the forest with practiced ease, attacked in small groups that appeared suddenly, fired, and then vanished back into the undergrowth before British soldiers could effectively respond. The European tactic of disciplined volley fire, devastating in open terrain, was nearly useless in conditions where the enemy was rarely visible. and targets appeared and disappeared within seconds. MacCarthy's artillery pieces, which should have provided a significant advantage, proved almost worthless in the forest environment. The guns couldn't be effectively aimed at enemies that couldn't be seen, and moving them through dense vegetation under fire was nearly impossible. The psychological impact of artillery, which often caused less disciplined forces to break and run, had no effect on Ashanti warriors who understood that the guns were nearly blind in the forest conditions. Some accounts suggest that the British ammunition for the artillery was the wrong caliber, a catastrophic logistical failure if true, but even with correct ammunition, the guns would have been of limited value given the tactical situation. The muskets carried by British soldiers and militia were single-shot weapons that required 30 seconds or more to reload. In the forest fighting at Nsamankow, this reload time was fatal. Ashanti warriors could fire from cover, then close with spears and swords before defenders could reload. The bayonets that British soldiers were trained to use in close combat were effective weapons, but they required organized formations and clear sight of the enemy, neither of which existed in the chaos of the forest battle. Individual British soldiers found themselves fighting for their lives against multiple opponents in close quarters combat where training meant less than desperation and numbers. Sir Charles MacCarthy himself, recognizing that the battle was lost, but apparently unable to comprehend how completely his assumptions had failed, attempted to rally his forces and organize a fighting withdrawal. Contemporary accounts suggest he fought with personal courage, shooting his pistols at attacking Ashanti warriors and attempting to maintain some semblance of command authority. But courage couldn't overcome the tactical reality. His column was surrounded, outnumbered, and fighting in conditions that negated every European advantage while maximizing Ashanti strengths. MacCarthy was killed in the fighting, though accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some sources suggest he was shot, others that he was killed in close combat. What is certain is that after his death, his body was mutilated according to Ashanti military custom. His head was severed and would be taken to Kumasi, the Ashanti capital, where it would be kept as a war trophy and displayed during ceremonies. His skull would allegedly be used as a drinking vessel for ceremonial occasions. The ultimate humiliation for a European commander who had so thoroughly underestimated his African opponents. This treatment of MacCarthy's remains, shocking to British sensibilities, was standard Ashanti practice for defeated enemy commanders and reflected their view of the battle as a significant military victory to be properly commemorated. The destruction of MacCarthy's column was comprehensive and methodical. The Ashanti forces, having surrounded the British, systematically eliminated resistance group by group. British soldiers and militia who attempted to form defensive positions were overwhelmed by numbers and attacked from multiple directions. Those who broke and tried to flee found the forest itself became a trap. The Ashanti warriors, familiar with the terrain, could move faster and track fleeing enemies through vegetation that Europeans found almost impenetrable. The wounded were killed where they lay, as Ashanti military custom didn't involve taking many prisoners during active combat. Of the approximately 500 men in MacCarthy's column, fewer than 20 Europeans survived to reach British coastal settlements. The survivors were mostly men who managed to escape early in the battle, and who had the luck or skill to evade Ashanti pursuit through miles of hostile forest. Their accounts given to horrified British officials in the days following the battle painted a picture of complete disaster. The column had been surrounded and destroyed. The governor killed and mutilated, and the Ashanti had demonstrated military capabilities far beyond what British intelligence had suggested. The African troops fighting alongside the British suffered similarly catastrophic casualties. Many were killed in the fighting, while others were captured or managed to flee to their home villages. The Allied coastal states that had provided these troops were shaken by the completeness of the British defeat and by the realization that British power, which they had relied on for protection against Ashanti expansion, had proven hollow. Several coastal allies would subsequently switch their allegiance to the Ashanti, recognizing that power on the Gold Coast resided in Kumasi, not in the British forts. The Ashanti losses at Nsamankow, while never precisely calculated, were relatively light given the scale of their victory. The advantages of fighting from ambush positions, of using terrain expertly, and of vastly outnumbering the opposition meant that Ashanti casualties were probably measured in hundreds rather than thousands. The battle demonstrated that sophisticated African military forces, operating in favorable terrain with good intelligence and sound tactics, could destroy European-led forces despite the latter's technological advantages. The immediate aftermath of Nsamankow saw Ashanti forces pressing their advantage, advancing toward the coast and threatening British positions that now seemed vulnerable after the destruction of the main British field force. Coastal settlements prepared for siege, with British officials frantically requesting reinforcements from other West African stations and from Britain itself. The psychological impact of the disaster was profound. The aura of European invincibility had been shattered, and both British and African populations on the coast questioned whether the British could maintain their presence in the face of Ashanti military power. The news of Nsamankow reached London several months after the battle, carried by ships from West Africa. The reaction was one of shock and anger mixed with a reluctant recognition that British policy in West Africa had been built on dangerous assumptions about African military capabilities. The death of a governor and the destruction of an entire column was a disaster on a scale that demanded response. But the question of what form that response should take divided British officials. Some argued for immediate military retaliation to avenge the defeat and restore British prestige. Others, more aware of the costs and difficulties of West African campaigning, argued for a more cautious approach. The British military response was ultimately delayed for several years while resources were concentrated elsewhere in the growing empire. When British forces did return in strength to the Gold Coast in 1826, they were far more numerous, better prepared for forest warfare, and possessed of a healthy respect for Ashanti military capabilities that MacCarthy had fatally lacked. The Battle of Catamanzo in 1826 would reverse the verdict of Nsamankow, with British forces defeating an Ashanti army through better tactics and overwhelming firepower. But Catamanzo was fought by a British force of several thousand men with substantial artillery support, not the overconfident colonial column that MacCarthy had led to destruction. The strategic consequences of Nsamankow extended far beyond the immediate military balance on the Gold Coast. The battle demonstrated to other African states that European forces could be decisively defeated when conditions favored African strengths. This encouraged resistance to European expansion across West Africa and suggested that European colonial projects would face serious military opposition from organized African states. The psychological impact of Nsamankow rippled across the region, influencing calculations about whether to accommodate or resist European pressure. The battle also forced a fundamental reassessment within British military and colonial circles about how to approach African warfare. The assumptions that had led MacCarthy to disaster, that small European forces could dominate through superior discipline and weapons, were recognized as dangerously inadequate when facing sophisticated African military organizations in terrain they controlled. Future British campaigns in West Africa would employ much larger forces, would gather more detailed intelligence about African military capabilities, and would treat African opponents with a respect that MacCarthy had fatally lacked. The tactical lessons of Nsamankow were studied by military professionals, though often through the distorting lens of racial assumptions that made learning difficult. The battle clearly demonstrated the importance of reconnaissance, the dangers of advancing into unfamiliar terrain against an unseen enemy, and the limitations of European military advantages when terrain negated formations and firepower. But many British officers struggled to accept that African forces could outfight European troops through superior tactics and generalship, rather than just through overwhelming numbers or surprise. This reluctance to fully credit African military sophistication would lead to future disasters when British forces again underestimated African opponents. The Ashanti perspective on Nsamankow was one of triumph and validation of their military system. The battle demonstrated that Ashanti forces could defeat European armies, that their tactics of envelopment and forest warfare were effective against supposedly superior opponents, and that the Ashanti Empire could maintain its independence through military strength. The victory was celebrated in Kumasi with elaborate ceremonies, with MacCarthy's skull displayed as the ultimate trophy of the empire's military prowess. Nsamankow became part of Ashanti military tradition, a reference point demonstrating what could be achieved through proper planning, superior tactics, and courage in battle. However, the Ashanti also recognized that Nsamankow was not a definitive end to conflict with the British. The coastal forts remained in British hands, and Ashanti leaders understood that Britain's global power meant that reinforcements could eventually arrive in numbers that would be difficult to resist. The victory bought time and established respect, but it didn't fundamentally resolve the strategic tensions between Ashanti expansion and British commercial interests on the coast. These tensions would continue to simmer, eventually leading to renewed conflict and, ultimately, to British conquest of the Ashanti Empire in the 1890s. The treatment of MacCarthy's remains, particularly the use of his skull, became a source of particular outrage in Britain and was used to portray the Ashanti as savage and barbaric. This propaganda served multiple purposes. It diverted attention from the military incompetence that had led to the disaster. It justified future military actions against the Ashanti as civilizing missions, and it reinforced racial hierarchies by emphasizing alleged African savagery. What this propaganda ignored was that the mutilation of enemy commanders was an Ashanti military tradition, not evidence of unique barbarity, and that European forces in various conflicts had engaged in comparable or worse treatment of defeated enemies. The Battle of Nsamankow occupies an important place in the history of African resistance to European colonialism. It demonstrated that African states with sophisticated military organizations could defeat European forces on favorable terms, challenging narratives of inevitable European conquest driven by technological superiority. The battle showed that terrain, tactics, leadership, and morale could overcome European advantages in weapons when African forces fought intelligently and with proper preparation. This made Nsamankow an important reference point for later African resistance movements, proof that European armies were not invincible. The impact on British military culture and policy was significant and lasting. The disaster led to more cautious approaches to military intervention in West Africa, with larger forces employed and more attention paid to intelligence and preparation. The battle contributed to a pattern where British expansion in Africa would be halting and contested, requiring substantial military commitments rather than the easy conquests that some had anticipated. The lesson that African opponents could be formidable contributed to the scramble for Africa dynamic later in the 19th century, where European powers sought to establish claims to territory before encountering organized resistance. For the coastal African states caught between Ashanti power and British presence, Nsamankow was a demonstration of the risks of alliance with apparently powerful but actually vulnerable European forces. Some shifted their allegiances toward the Ashanti, Others tried to maintain neutrality, and a few remained loyal to the British, while hoping for reinforcements that would restore the balance of power. The battle demonstrated that power relationships in West Africa were fluid, and that military capability mattered more than diplomatic declarations or treaty obligations. The psychological and cultural impact of Nsamankow extended into literature and art, becoming a reference point in discussions of empire and resistance. The image of a European governor being killed and decapitated by African warriors challenged comfortable narratives about European superiority and African passivity. While British accounts often emphasize the savagery of MacCarthy's treatment to deflect from the military defeat, the battle also produced a grudging respect for Ashanti military capabilities that influenced British approaches to subsequent conflicts. The individual experiences of the few survivors shaped British understanding of the battle, though their accounts were filtered through trauma, cultural assumptions, and the need to explain an inexplicable disaster. Survivors described the sudden overwhelming of the column, the difficulty of fighting in dense forest, the sophistication of Ashanti tactics, and the completeness of the defeat. These accounts, while valuable, also tended to emphasize factors like overwhelming numbers or surprise to avoid acknowledging that British forces had been comprehensively outfought by supposedly inferior opponents. When we reflect on the Battle of Nsamankow, nearly 2 centuries later, we see it as a significant moment in the history of African-European military encounters. The battle demonstrated that European technological advantages were not decisive when African forces could leverage superior numbers, knowledge of terrain, and sophisticated tactics. It showed that imperial confidence was no substitute for proper intelligence, respect for the enemy, and sound tactical judgment, and it proved that African military organizations could compete successfully with European forces when conditions favored their strengths. Nsamankow stands as a reminder that European colonial expansion in Africa was not an inevitable march of progress, but a contested process where African states sometimes won significant victories. The complete destruction of MacCarthy's column was not a minor skirmish but a major military disaster that halted British expansion in West Africa for years and forced a fundamental reassessment of how to approach African warfare. The battle demonstrated African military sophistication and European vulnerability in ways that challenged dominant narratives about race, technology, and imperial power. The day an African army wiped out a British column at Nsamankow was also the day when comfortable assumptions about European military superiority were shattered in the forests of the Gold Coast. Sir Charles MacCarthy's confidence that discipline and muskets would easily overcome African opposition was revealed as fatal hubris when Ashanti forces demonstrated superior tactics, battlefield intelligence, and fighting spirit. The 500 men who marched confidently into the forest became, with few exceptions, casualties or trophies of an Ashanti victory that announced to the British Empire that conquest in Africa would be far more difficult, costly, and contested than simple narratives of technological determinism suggested. The forest at Nsamankow, where British soldiers died by the hundreds and a governor's head became a war trophy, stands as a monument to the dangers of underestimating one's opponent and the costs of imperial overconfidence. The battle demonstrated that African states could defeat European forces decisively when they controlled the terms of engagement, that military technology was only one factor among many determining battlefield outcomes, and that courage, planning, and tactical sophistication could overcome material advantages. These lessons, written in British blood in a West African forest, would eventually be learned, but only after repeated disasters taught the British Empire that African opponents deserved respect and that imperial expansion would require far more than arrogance and assumptions of superiority.